Good morning. It's good to see everyone here today. The theme for this month is trust. Beverly and I settled on one aspect: self-compassion. We need compassion to sustain a life of trust in a brighter way of being. It occurred to me that I might not be the best spokesperson for the topic. But a thought struck me. All compassion is self-compassion. In other words, all the compassion I extend arises from and returns to me. With this insight, I was lit and set out to discover more. Perhaps my favorite example of compassion is from the Dalai Lama's interview with a Tibetan monk who had suffered violence, starvation, and humiliation at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. The Dalai Lama recalls, "He told me the guards forced him to denounce his religion. They tortured him in prison. I asked him whether he was ever afraid. The monk then told me, yes, there was one thing I was afraid of. I was afraid I might lose compassion for the Chinese." I don't think that would be my initial response. How about you? So I ask you, how is it possible to embrace your captors with such clemency and grace? Perhaps psychology and neuropsychology can give us some clues. You may recall Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a model of human motivation and potential. In 1943, when Maslow first published his work, he proposed that the highest level of human development is self-actualization. That is, realizing one's full potential. But by 1967, not long before his death, Maslow had changed his perspective. He now saw the pinnacle of a person's growth as self-transcendence. Simply put, human beings may feel a drive to become all they can be, but once this urge is met, they may realize needs beyond themselves to pursue goals that have little to do with the self at all. In the 21st century, researchers take this idea further. Chris Niebauer, professor of cognitive neuropsychology, studies the brain's ability to transcend the personal self, what we typically call the ego. Compassion, he says, has a special home on the right side of the brain. To illustrate this, he cites those who have suffered a stroke with temporary injury to the left brain. They report having felt compassionate, nurturing, and an expanded sense of grace. The left brain ego, which previously viewed itself as separate, was replaced by connected fluidity. After the stroke, they no longer perceived the boundaries of where they ended and everybody else began. Based on his study of these patients, Niebauer explains that compassion is about grasping the big picture, a faculty at which the right brain excels. It's the ability to see another person as potentially ourselves, to see the interconnectivity of all things. If that sounds familiar, we know it as the UU seventh principle. It seems that true compassion only occurs when we can imagine ourselves in the position of another. Now let's bring this full circle. Tibetan monks and Abraham Maslow recognized something that science continues to quantify: our capacity as humans to live beyond the urgency of individual experience and conditioning. For many of us, this realization may be on again, off again. For example, we may feel inspired by a Sunday morning homily, but find ourselves in a world of hurt with the evening news. On another day, our sunny thoughts might turn fiery when we realize that our GPS is lost in traffic, and so are we. If you are like me, you can swing between insight and intolerance, living most days with grace and grievance. But in this fellowship, we know that some of our goals and desires are transpersonal, those that surpass the needs of a solitary self. We realize that we can exceed personal limitations when we see ourselves in the position of another. We may never experience the transcendence of monks or right brain dominance, but we can live in compassion and hold tight in trust to a brighter way of being. May it be so. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. The reading today is by a Max Ehrmann from the 1920s, titled Desiderata. I found this or discovered it for myself when I was in my early teens, and it's always spoken to me. Go placidly amid the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. As far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly, and listen to others, even the dull and ignorant. They too have their story. Avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexations to the spirit. If you compare yourselves with others, you may become vain and bitter. For always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself. Enjoy your achievements as well as your plans. Keep interested in your own career, however humble. It is a real possession in the changing fortunes of time. Exercise caution in your business affairs, for the world is full of trickery. But let this not blind you to what virtue there is. Many persons strive for high ideals, and everywhere life is full of heroism. Be yourself, especially do not feign affection, neither be cynical about love, for in the face of all aridity and disenchantment, it is as perennial as the grass. Take kindly the counsel of the years, gracefully surrendering the things of youth. Nurture strength of spirit to shield you in sudden misfortune, but don't distress yourself with dark imaginings. Many fears are born of fatigue and loneliness. Beyond a wholesome discipline, be gentle with yourself. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. Therefore, be at peace with God, whatever you conceive him to be, and whatever your labors and aspirations in the noisy confusion of life, keep peace with your soul. With all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world. Be cheerful and strive to be happy.
Susan and Joan reminding us about being gentle with ourselves, the topic for today, really. And I particularly enjoyed the story about Beverly, the girl who never made mistakes. Yeah, my parents misnamed me, obviously. So my talk is titled Kidney Failure, and you'll soon see why. One morning, many years ago, when my career as a science writer was in its infancy, I was part of a telephone conference for a team planning a new biology textbook. As the anointed writer, I had done a sample chapter on the human urinary system, which includes the anatomy and workings of the kidneys. Now, as some of you, maybe many of you may recall from a long ago biology class, our kidneys house structures called nephrons, whose job is to filter the blood, removing impurities, any excess water from that beer or two, and any other unwanted substances, and these all go into the forming urine. And at the same time that the kidneys are doing that, needed substances are being shunted back into the bloodstream. It's cleansing the blood. So soon after the teleconference got underway, a highly experienced content editor hired for the project said she had gone through my chapter and discovered an unexpected problem. The description of kidney nephron functioning got certain basics of the filtering process dead wrong. I had garbled the discussion of a key mechanism. I think the phrase the editor used was, "It's backward," demonstrating for all to hear that I hadn't known what I didn't know. A mistake like the one I had made can be the kiss of death when you're presenting yourself as a competent science writer. Now, these 40 years later, after having had a wonderfully satisfying career as an author of college biology textbooks, who would guess, and family reference books, and being a developer and co-author of a bunch of other books and print products, National Park Service and the federal government, I vividly recall sitting on the edge of my bed that traumatic day, overcome with self-loathing. I had an advanced degree in science journalism from Berkeley and had written a thesis published in a national popular science magazine. Yet my inaugural performance as a professional science writer had been, to put it mildly, woefully imperfect. Now, at the time, I was a single mother of a 7-year-old special needs child. So jumping off the Bay Bridge or slinking away in shame wasn't an option. I had to work. I needed to make money. Hence, I took on a new role offered to me as a developmental editor on biology textbooks, working my tail off and becoming a sponge for biological science for the next 8 years, an apprenticeship that ultimately launched my science writing career. Now, it's hard, impossible really, to forget a kidney failure like the one I experienced that day so many years ago. Having grown up in a household where behavioral perfection was a basic survival skill, I have spent much of my adult life dreading making mistakes, being far less than perfect. I've always been my most brutal critic. So even after having weathered a number of tough situations in life, I'm almost 78, I still wrestle with never really trusting myself to be good enough. Not smart enough, or thin enough, or pretty enough, or disciplined enough, or successful enough, or being a good enough mother or grandmother, or a lip syncer in the time warp. Goodness gracious, have I even been a good enough widow? Have I properly navigated the profound unmooring of one's life that comes with losing a beloved spouse after a long and pretty darn good marriage? If you let it, the assumption that only by being as close as possible to perfect in all things, that assumption can ramify through just about every aspect of your life. Take it from me. And it's so harmful to your inner peace, to your lovely, delicate, sweet human spirit. In this regard, in 2023, a book came out titled Outlive: The Science and Art of Longevity. Now, I've been told I may make it to triple digits, so I was interested in that book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. The author, Dr. Peter Attia, I think I got that right, is a medical doctor, and he included a chapter that was appeared to have been added on to the very end of the book, as maybe an afterthought. But he included a chapter titled Work in Progress: The High Price of Ignoring Emotional Health. In that chapter, Attia tells the story of a highly successful, accomplished, well-known patient of his who was in danger of essentially working himself to death. When Dr. Attia told the man that his life might depend on having a better work-life balance, the man said he couldn't, because only a steady flow of successes prevented him from feeling like an utter failure in life. I can relate to that because for a long time I was that person too. Now, occasional self-doubt, the feeling that maybe one should or should not have done something differently, all these shoulds, is a normal part of life. It's normal because we all make mistakes, and mistakes cause emotional pain because a mistake implies or sometimes screams that you've been imperfect. Whether it's a lack of knowledge, as in my case of kidney failure, or a bad choice, a pain that's visited upon you by choices and behavior of others, or by circumstances you can't control. When you don't measure up to your personal expectations, you can adjust them. In my case, okay, I wasn't cut out to be a science writer, but I could be a developmental editor, a DE. That would be something okay, and I could make a living. That adjusting can be helpful if it leads to a deeper understanding of the demands of a chosen profession, or the best recipe for making Peking duck, or some other activity, or simply being alive in a world of other, inevitably imperfect human beings. Now, I first began nibbling around the edges of Buddhist thought when my husband Jack asked me very quietly to please work less. My grudging response, and it was grudging, was to hole up in my home office only 6 days a week instead of 7. Dealing with the pain that results from being imperfect, for me, is a theme that runs through Buddhist teachings. A well-known nugget of Buddhist wisdom is that while pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. When I first encountered that saying, I thought, what the heck? I actually thought something slightly, different from that. But to me, to put it politely, that sounded like bull honky. Suffering is all too real. You falter in your work, or yell at your kid or partner, or mess up in some other aspect of an important relationship. Unless you're a total jerk, most likely you feel bad about your mistake. Maybe you've been rejected by a job, as I was, or by someone you want to be friends with, or by a romantic interest. So you may inwardly castigate yourself, immediately start looking for what was wrong with you, and feel less than, not enough. A few more autobiographical examples. My first husband, my son's father, kicked me to the curb in favor of a woman who, unlike me, wouldn't forget to stir the sugar in his tea. What a failure. An insecure but very powerful co-author, once arranged to have my name left off the cover of a biology book I co-wrote over 2 years, convincing the marketing folks that it wouldn't look good to have too many author names on the cover. I was mortified when the perfectly swirled whipped cream on a banana cream pie I made for my best friend's birthday party collapsed into a wan, white puddle because I had failed to add a smidgen of cornstarch to it. More recently, and this is, very close to me even now, as my late husband Jack rose in the middle of the night, vomiting and struggling to breathe, getting dressed, and ultimately dying of sudden cardiac arrest, thanks to my having taken a single Advil PM, I lay in our bed fast asleep. I was there next to him to hold his hand while he passed into the mystery of death. I could go on, but I'm not going to. But the point is, in my life, as in the lives of all human beings, mistakes, setbacks, fears, misunderstandings, and poor choices have led me to second-guess my being enough, just being worthy, just as I am. Now, Ken Wells, a psychotherapist and pioneer in the treatment of people suffering from various forms of addiction, has written that no one ever beats themselves up to a better place. He goes on to say, and I quote, "When you fail to measure up to what you intended, it is important to adjust the way you treat yourself. When you just blow it, either by relapsing into some maladaptive behavior or falling short of treating yourself and others with respect and dignity, you need to practice ignoring the inner critical voice. You need to embrace your imperfect behavior by positively affirming who you are." Wells concludes by saying that imperfection contains what he calls the secret message the universe would like you to have: to live life in harmony. Striving to be perfect, he says, deafens your inner voice telling you the message of the universe. When you persist towards perfection, you will hide your inevitable shortcomings and run from the message those shortcomings have for you. Managing imperfection requires that you listen to the failure, to the pain of failure and shortcomings. Now, pretty much any Buddhist would have said, well, duh. Which brings me to self-compassion, finally. What I think of as giving oneself grace. Self-compassion is the tool that can help us inevitably, imperfect human beings, navigate our lives when emotional or psychic pain arrives and threatens to mire us in, all the should-haves and should-nots. Basically, self-compassion involves recognizing the difference between making a mistake and being a bad person. Self-compassion allows us to hear the cosmic voice saying, "You are enough, just the flawed, imperfect way that you are." It's not a matter of being self-confident or having high self-esteem. I'm a pretty confident person. No matter how generally self-confident and self-assured we may be or come across, like the high-achieving, Uber-driven patient Dr. Attia wrote about, we all have things we struggle with. We all have an anxiety closet. I think of Where the Wild Things Are, that children's book. We all have an anxiety closet, or the darkness under the bed, where we keep fears and the like. So how do we respond in a healthy way to failure and shortcomings? This process has two main elements: mindfulness and self-compassion. And if you Google those things, you'll just get pages and pages of advice on that. But what some mental health experts describe as self-kindness. Now, according to my own personal mashup of Wikipedia, an AI definition generator, and a couple of dictionaries, mindfulness is the cognitive skill, often developed through meditation, but not necessarily, of having keen awareness of the contents of one's own mind in the present moment, accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and bodily sensations without judging them, just accepting, seeing them as they are. Being mindful isn't just a breezy thing you do, especially where emotionally painful or traumatic experiences are concerned. In fact, it can be hugely challenging to look your pain and suffering in the eye, as it were, pretty scary. To say, for example, I'm bereft and unmoored due to the loss of a job or a pet or a spouse, a child, a parent, or some other beloved person. Among the most difficult traumas arise from verbal, physical, or sexual abuse or serious neglect in childhood. Profound grief and mourning, explosive acting out, and other behaviors that harm us or others are the expression of those realities, those painful things of human existence, and we all experience at least some of them in our life. So taking a mindful approach to the pain from losses that feel particularly unfair can be really difficult because the brain's fundamental job, if you will, is to solve the problems we encounter as living organisms, and in the case of humans and some other animals, sentient beings. You know, like a sponge. A sponge doesn't have a brain, so a sponge never feels guilty about anything, but you know, some of us not so much. Some, perhaps many people, struggle with the concept of mindfulness in the face of painful or traumatic experiences because their brain is busy trying to solve the problem, sometimes by numbing us or suppressing deeply painful feelings and memories. So what's self-compassion then? Compassio, the Latin root of the English word compassion, means to suffer together with. An article in the Clinical Psychology Review tells us that compassion is the product of a sequence of first becoming aware of something, mindfulness, then feeling, letting yourself feel it, and then responding. This sequence holds when some event triggers our feelings of compassion towards someone else who is suffering in some way, as Joan so eloquently spoke of. You see a friend weeping, process that as my friend is upset, and then give them a big hug. The same sequence also is the basis for self-compassion. Mindfulness is a key tool here. First, we have to notice or admit what we're suffering about what is really at the deep core of something that's making us unhappy. Now, I was going to tell a short story. If there's time, I won't go on into it. I just figured it just had the time that my dad punished my older sister because I tattled on her, and my heart just hurt for the next 70 years. Then finally, in self-compassion, we must take the third step, which is taking action that in some way or another, which, in that little example I just mentioned, involved granting myself some grace at the age of like 70 by acknowledging the reality that as an 8-year-old I couldn't predict and had no power to change my dad's behavior that evening. I also emailed my sister up in Portland, who's now almost 81, to discuss the scene that happened 70 years ago and tell her, I felt guilty about this my whole life. Never fear. The story has a happy ending. My sister said, gosh, Bevy, I don't even remember that. You know, so self-compassion, some thought leaders do call it self-kindness, is often misunderstood. So summarizing, here are just 3 of the misconceptions, and I'm almost done. People often have about it. Self-compassion, misconception number 1, equates to personal weakness. No. that self-compassion isn't a character flaw. In reality, it's an antidote to self-pity, shame, because it silences our harsh inner critic and opens us to accept, experience, and acknowledge difficult feelings without judgment. A great deal of modern research in human psychology indicates that this kinder approach helps people process and let go of difficult feelings more fully. Misconception number 2, self-compassion is an indulgent effort to erase responsibility for my mistakes. No, it's simply a non-punitive acknowledgement that we're all imperfect, people who are impacted by things over which we have no control, our genes, early family history, culture, life circumstances. It doesn't relieve you of the responsibility to own your mistakes and make amends if that's appropriate. Misconception, the last one I'm going to mention, is just another term for self-pity, that pity party, that it's easy to have. Nope, when someone feels self-pity, they become immersed in their own problems, forget that others have similar problems, and they instead become wrapped up in their own emotional dramas. Self-compassion, on the other hand, allows us to see very clearly, more clearly, I know this has been true for me, the related experiences of me, myself, and others, minus feelings of isolation and disconnection. It is a reconnector to everybody that you are interacting with. Taking the perspective of a compassionate other towards oneself reminds us of the broader human context of all our experiences and helps put things in greater perspective. The most common barrier to developing self-compassion is our inner critic, which often has origins in our developmental past, such as parental rejection, hostility, neglect, and emotional unresponsiveness. I've had some of those things. I know that as I continue to work on becoming self-compassionate, my inner critic is giving me a real workout, but it's a process and one well worth the effort. Self-compassion, suffering together, is really about treating yourself like a beloved friend instead of a blame-worthy loser or someone who's less than in some way. With self-compassion, you recognize that, like everyone else on the face of the earth, you are personally imperfect, living an imperfect life. But when something goes wrong, you aren't knee-jerk self-critical. Instead, you acknowledge that everyone has issues and struggles because those things are part and parcel of being human. Now, I titled my remarks today as Giving Yourself Grace, the Power of Self-Compassion. Recently, my dental hygienist recommended a new toothpaste that she said would be totally life-changing, just like that. It's life-changing, and I'm sitting there in the chair with it, one of those things hanging from my lip. Well, the toothpaste was a dud, but in my experience thus far with self-compassion, it is actually life-changing. It is actually life-changing. It doesn't mean you go around all the time chanting, I'm so amazing, I'm so amazing, I'm forgiven for everything. No, nurturing self-compassion means becoming a better support person for yourself. It means mellowing the carping of your nasty inner critic. It means helping you connect with the parts of yourself that actually are wise and caring, despite your inner struggles and difficulties. In my life, it has meant becoming, I think, significantly more skillful in coping with life's challenges, more accepting of others, more resilient, and ultimately just happier with who I am.